Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics presentation, the multi-billion-dollar question. How should new CFP and Division I revenues be used? I'm Sandy Hatfield Clubb. I've had the pleasure of serving on the Knight Commission consulting team, and today I'm going to serve as your moderator. We have a great deal of information to share with you, and it's important that we leave time for questions and discussion. In the interest of time, I'll briefly introduce our first speaker, and then other introductions will occur along the way. If you're participating virtually and you would like to ask questions during the discussion at the end of the presentation, you're welcome to submit questions by using the Q&A function. I will now turn it over to Chief Operating Officer of the Knight Commission, Amy Perko, to kick us off.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks again for being here with us this morning. So from its inception, Knight Commission's work has been driven by values. Our purpose is to lead transformational change that prioritizes the education, health, safety, and success of college athletes. As an independent organization, we conduct research, engage experts to inform our diverse membership of thought leaders, and you can see our membership on this slide. We don't pretend to have all of the answers or the perfect solutions, but our legacy has been to provide research and careful thought to concepts, principles, and ideas that can lead to effective policies. Our presentation will address the multi-billion-dollar question: how should new college football playoff and Division I revenues be used? We are in one of the most pivotal periods in college sports history. Today, we will present a strong case as to why now is a critical time to act. And to put this conversation into context, we will review the current Division I financial landscape and what the future has in store if there is no major policy change and spending patterns continue with more than $1 billion in new revenue. We will conclude with solutions to the billion-dollar question. Major changes have occurred over the last 2 years, and there are significant changes on the horizon that will mark this era as a pivotal period in college sports. The first three items on this slide identify significant changes that I'm sure all of you are familiar with that occurred in 2021 and 2022. First, and just real briefly with each of these, in June of 2021, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against the NCAA in NCAA versus Austin, a ruling that prohibits the NCAA from creating any national rule to limit educational benefits schools can provide. The second major change occurred when NCAA rules granted college athletes access to earn money from third parties for the use of their name, image, and likeness. The third major area of transformation comes from the explosion of conference media rights, which are due in large part to FBS football. These media rights have influenced recent conference realignments. The CFP expansion will result in a postseason football playoff that dwarfs NCAA March Madness revenues. We will talk more about the projected impact of the influx of billions in new revenues through the CFP expansion and the Power 5 conference media deals. The final two items noted on this slide are the Transformation Committee recommendations and the possibility through judicial and/or administrative rulings that college athletes will be considered employees. In addition to this potential major change, there continues to be looming litigation that could have significant financial consequences. To highlight why now is the time to act, I will turn it over to Eric Barron, a Knight Commission member and President Emeritus of Penn State.
Well, we all know from our institutions that reallocating resources is challenging. But when any organization receives an influx of resources, especially when it's a very large sum of money, it's the ideal time to pause on the allocation trends that we've been following in the past and use it as an opportunity to make strategic decisions about how to use that funding. The CFP expansion will result and more than $1 billion in new revenues. Reminds me of a moment in the Big Ten when we received one of our new media agreements, leading to a big increase in revenue for each one of the institutions. A number of presidents were concerned that the rapid growth in sports revenue, combined with flat or declining resources for academic pursuits, presented a significant issue, not to mention what was going on with widespread discussion and the growth in coaches' salaries and facilities and the legal landscape that college athletics was facing. We decided to use it as an opportunity to fund areas that are difficult to fund from tuition dollars. Think libraries, think supporting student mental health, think supporting an art museum. Each of us decided we would earmark $4 million of the funds from the media contract and focus those $4 million per year on academic needs within our institutions, while also gaining more dollars for athletics. There's something very appealing about the fact that you're using athletics to support the academy in new and innovative ways. There's another recent example of new money leading to big change. In 2015, the NCAA began to prepare new March Madness revenues, which were increasing because of the result of the media contract extension. The NCAA membership enacted the values-based revenue distribution working group's recommendation to change Division I revenue distribution to add an academic performance unit. The new academic performance incentive went into effect when the new revenues came into the system. Again, using it as an opportunity, using new revenues to align incentives with values. With the coming new revenues from CFP expansion, now is the time for presidents to provide leadership. It is the key time, the key opportunity before any of those dollars are budgeted. The Transformation Committee's work is focused on new financial commitments for the entire Division I membership, but it's vitally important for the presidents managing the college football playoff to recognize the role this marquee event plays on the entire landscape. I served on the management committee for the CFP as a Big Ten representative and understand the drive for resources outside of NCAA system, while the NCAA still covers the national cost of FBS football and is responsible for the overall governance of the sport. I have to say it's probably a basic principle in management that you don't divorce the revenues from the management of an operation. It is Knight Commission's position that the CFP revenue should be coupled with the national expenses to govern and operate FBS football. Now is the time, the key time, to correct that misalignment. Now is also the ideal time when significant new resources are available to do more to prioritize the student athlete. The issue was not addressed by the Transformation Committee, and presidents on the governing boards of the NCAA and CFP must address the important financial issue before the very first game of expanded playoffs are played and before schools begin to budget any new distributions from the expanded playoffs. This is the key opportunity. Now I'll turn it back to Sandy Hatfield Clubb to discuss the current financial landscape.
Thank you, President Barron. The next series of slides will examine the current and future projections of the Division I financial landscape. It's important to know there's a lot of detail on these slides, and we're going to move through them very quickly. This slide, the entire deck, will be available on our website after the presentation. This slide underscores the dramatic financial changes among the Power 5 schools from 2005 to 2020 from only two revenue sources, conference media contracts and CFP revenues, shown in blue, and the NCAA distributions are shown in red. The key point here is that the revenue represented in blue exploded with nearly 500% growth over a 15-year period. And this is largely due to the media contracts associated with Power 5 football and the launch and growth of the CFP. And as we will demonstrate with future projection, the growth continues. To provide perspective on how the exponential growth in revenues among Power 5 schools has widened the financial gap with the rest of Division I, this slide represents the 2020 median total revenues for the D1 subdivisions. You can see the median for the non-football playing schools on the far right at 16 million and up to more than 125 million for the median Power 5 schools as seen on the left. The next several slides draw data from the Nighthouse College Athletics Base, which organizes the data reported by Division I institutions on their NCAA financial reports. This slide shows sources of revenue as a percentage of overall revenues at the median in each D1 subdivision. Again, from left to right, you can see D1 FBS Power 5 schools, FBS Group of 5 schools, FCS schools, and schools with no football. The burgundy color represents institutional and government support, and the orange represents student fees. The most important point here is that the schools outside of the Power 5 rely heavily on these two sources of revenue. For more than half of their revenue, up to more than 2/3 of their athletics revenue are from institutional and government support and student fees. The Power 5 FBS schools have a very different revenue profile, with less than 3% of their revenue from these sources. As shown on the bar graph, their major revenue sources are from conference distributions through media rights deals and postseason football, donor contributions, and ticket sales. The key point here is that the revenue sources for Power 5 schools are significantly different than the rest of Division I. For the non-Power 5 schools, this raises questions about what new revenue will support the new spending mandates. This slide shows the major expenses organized in the same way as the previous slide by D1 subdivisions from left to right. Again, Power 5, Group of 5, FCS, D1 schools with no football, and with major expenses noted in different colors. We don't want to spend time examining all of the expense categories. You can note that as a percentage of expenses across the different classification levels, the spending proportions are similar, except for in the area in dark blue, which is student aid or benefits. A key point here is that the Group of 5, FCS, and no football schools of their budgets on athletics aid and benefits. This slide drills down to demonstrate the median dollars spent on student aid and benefits in each D1 subdivision. Power 5 schools spend significantly more dollars in this area, a median of $13.3 million, even though this spending is far less a percentage of their overall expenditures. One of the goals moving forward is to direct more money towards athlete education, health, and safety benefits. Over the past decade, the emphasis on competitive advantage has driven a disproportionate increase in 3 areas: coaching salaries, severance pay, and coaching buyouts and facilities. You will see on the following slide that the athletic student aid has grown much more slowly than these 3 areas. One of the major financial concerns has been disproportionate growth in coaching salaries, particularly football coaching. This slide shows that from 2011 to 2020 in the Power 5 programs, football head and assistant salaries grew by 81%, as represented in the top line in green. This growth has been more than twice as fast as the growth of athletic aid to college athletes, which is represented on the bottom blue line. It's notable that during this period, athletes began receiving the new cost of attendance stipends. We want to note here that we are not trying to pick on the Power Five by only showing their trends, but the revenue and spending by these programs are at the core of the external pressures to change college sports, and it is important to understand the trends of the past in this pivotal period of change. For those who have an interest, anyone can use our database to explore the trends for other D1 subdivisions, conferences, and public schools. Over a similar 10-year financial cycle, severance pay for FBS football head and assistant coaches ballooned, totaling more than $500 million. This slide shows that the coaching buyouts reached new extremely high levels when FBS schools, not just the Power Five, began receiving new revenues through the launch and growth of the college football playoff. Once more recent cycles are factored in, the data will show that since the CFP began, football coaching severance has tripled. When starting these series of slides, I noted that the areas that experienced disproportionate growth when revenues increased were coaching compensation, coaching buyouts, and facilities. This slide shows the impact of facility investments. Among the 112 public FBS programs for which this data was drawn, these institutions pay a combined $708 million in annual debt service payments. The next series of slides shifts our view to the future on how revenues are projected to change and how expenses may look if current trends prevail. The Knight Commission engaged Clifton Larson Allen, or CLA, a national financial services firm, to conduct an analysis and provide projections on a few key financial areas if past trends continue. These projections consider the $500 million to $1 billion in new revenues that FBS schools will receive through the expanded CFP and new conference media contract revenues that the Big Ten and SEC, members, as well as the normal annual growth rate. This slide is focused on spending and projections for 52 Power Five programs at public institutions in the three expense categories that were displayed in the earlier slide: football coaching salaries with all sports other than football, and student aid. The football coaching salaries are in green, non-football coaching salaries in red, and the student aid line is in blue. The CLA projections assume that the coaching limitations currently in place will persist. The 2030 projections for the countable head and assistant football coaches show an increase of 353% since 2011, up to $1.5 billion annually for about 575 coaches at just 52 public schools. On the other hand, athletic student aid line on the bottom in blue is projected again to show a slower growth rate with an increase to $1.2 billion annually in 2030 for more than 30,000 athletes, up 102% since 2011. The Knight Commission strongly believes the explosive growth rates for coaching salaries at this level must be moderated. Another area of explosive growth since the college football playoff revenues came into the system is FBS football coaching severance pay. We asked CLA, this slide shows the historical trend for FBS head and assistant coach severance that you saw earlier. We asked CLA to use the data to project what these buyouts might total in 2030 under the existing trends and considering new revenues. The most conservative projection is that football coaches' severance will be a combined $155 million among FBS schools in 2030. To take another view using a common methodology of applying the growth rate from 2015 to 2019, the projection is actually $350 million in 2030 for FBS schools. As President Barron shared, the time to change the course is now. What is needed to change the course and direct more of the increasing revenues to college athlete education, health, and safety? The NCAA Transformation Committee is proposing several changes to achieve this outcome. Those changes would include new Division I membership requirements that require greater investment in athlete support, like financial assistance through degree completion and other increased support, particularly in health and safety. The Knight Commission believes that this approach is a good start, and the new commitments are consistent with the priorities we've championed. However, there is a large influx of money coming for a subgroup of D1 schools, and the changes must go farther in the areas of governance, finance, and equity. I would like to introduce Knight Commission member and Director of Football Affairs with Los Angeles Rams, Jacques McClendon, to share where these changes are needed to proactively address the multi-billion-dollar question: how should new CFP and D1 revenues be used?
Thank you, Sandy. The Knight Commission believes that changes are needed in three key areas to proactively address the multi-billion-dollar question, that these changes are possible and necessary now. The first of these key areas is governance. The primacy of education must be at the center of the structure and governance of college sports and be clearly prioritized through financial incentives and allocations. While Division I sports is big business, it is an educational enterprise and must be governed with the context of higher education. The Knight Commission has long championed the importance of adding independent directors to the governing boards of Divisions I, II, III, and the College Football Playoff Management Board. In order to combat the self-interest that dominates the competitive nature of college sports and governance decisions, it is critical to provide objective oversight. We further believe that these governing boards should include medical experts, current and former athletes with legitimate voice in the governance process. Our final key point where change is needed in governance was mentioned earlier by President Barron, and that is the governance. In the critical area of finances, college sports must initiate a plan to address current before the exponential financial growth of more than $1 billion in FBS football takes place over the next 3 to 5 years. That plan should include accountability measures to ensure that finances focus on the education, health, safety, and well-being of collegiate athletes. In 2021, the Knight Commission proposed a set of 5 principles that can help sports create such a plan. And in a few minutes, Amy will review those principles in our care model. We are pleased to see the Transformation Committee's proposal includes the components of our plan, particularly requiring more revenues to be devoted to athlete education, health and safety, consistent with our principles. The third area where change is needed is equity. There must be more accountability that requires equity in how shared revenues are awarded and used. College sports can do more to close racial equity gaps and create equitable pathways for Black college athletes during and after college. As an example, in 2022, we commissioned independent research to examine if institutions are qualifying for financial awards through the NCAA's new academic incentive program with large racial graduation gaps in GSR scores. The review showed that there are D1 schools that have more than a 25 percentage point gap between the graduation success rates of their white and Black athletes, and yet still receive financial incentives from the NCAA for academic success. As a result, last May, the Knight Commission proposed a racial equity standard to be used as a filter before schools can receive the Division I academic service incentive. Another equity issue that requires attention is gender equity. The Knight Commission proposed changes to the NCAA's revenue distribution to address the current inequity that exists with regard to the hundreds of millions in financial incentives that are currently awarded for athletics performance only in men's basketball. The Kaplan report commissioned by the NCAA also recommends, while we are pleased the Transformation Committee acknowledged the need for a change to the athletics performance incentive in the NCAA distribution, we continue to be disappointed in the presidential inaction at the board level on this. The issue requires entirely more urgent leadership. Now I'll turn it back to Amy Perko.
Thanks, Jacques. Again, we know we're presenting a lot of information, and if you have questions about some of these recommendations, there's a lot of information on our website, but we'll be available to talk afterwards. I do want to note that Jacques was co-chair or vice chair of our racial equity task force that Lynn Elmore, Shantiana Keys also provided leadership for, that worked really hard, and that racial equity standard for the academic incentives was one that they developed and presented to the NCAA Committee on Academics. So moving forward with this presentation, I have a handful of slides to summarize that summarize our solutions specifically, and then I'll provide some key takeaways, and then we'll open it up to questions. So the Knight Commission has conducted independent research and sought out key expert insight, including from antitrust attorneys, to create a number of financial solutions that can be implemented today. And again, we don't need an act of Congress to implement any of the solutions you're going to see. The first set of Knight Commission solutions are focused on aligning CFP revenues with governance and national expenses for the sport of FBS football. As this audience understands, the NCAA receives zero in revenue from the CFP and does not operate that championship. This basic fact is frankly widely misunderstood by the public at large, and particularly lawmakers who are designing their own solutions for college sports. If CFP revenues funded the national expenses to operate the sport of football, including the cost for enforcement, insurance, and litigation, tens of millions in NCAA funding would free up to allocate to priority areas. And it would benefit not only Division I, but II and III, but it would help all Division I schools fund the new health and safety mandates. In their own study of these issues, Lead One estimated these FBS football national costs currently covered by the NCAA to total more than $60 million. A related solution is to change the NCAA revenue distribution formula so that only NCAA championship sports are counted in the distribution. This change would exclude the sport of FBS football from counting in calculations like the number of scholarship athletes and the number of sports. This exclusion would occur since the CFP, not the NCAA, operates the national championship event for that sport and makes all decisions on shared revenue for the sport of FBS football. Put simply, the CFP is the revenue distribution that gives schools credit for the sport of FBS football. In 2020, we engaged CLA previously to model this change. The modeling showed that this one change would result in another $61 to $66 million becoming available for redistribution annually to Division I members. If the NCAA formula stayed the same, the result would be more than $100,000 annually to non-FBS schools. A handful of FBS schools that offer more sports than other FBS schools would also benefit from this change. That CLA full report of the impact is on our website. It is our view that this change in revenue distribution formula should have changed in 2015 when FBS football launched its own national championship with a lucrative revenue distribution system separate from the NCAA. The other solution is the Knight Commission's proposal to connect athletics revenues with the educational model of college sports, fittingly dubbed the CARE model. We released this model in September of 2021, and the CARE model requires that shared revenues are tethered directly to the educational purpose, with a special emphasis on the core principles of transparency, independent oversight, gender equity, broad-based athletics opportunities, and financial responsibility. For the focus of our presentation here, we will highlight the principle of financial responsibility that recommends a conference-based approach to providing greater accountability for the spending of shared revenues toward education-centric priorities. A conference-based approach to implementing the care model is recommended for 3 reasons. 1, conferences across Division I have different financial models, as you've seen. 2, the similar characteristics of conference schools make it more likely to achieve consensus on challenging financial issues. And as specified in the Alston ruling, conference level action is more likely to withstand antitrust scrutiny. The care model report provides 3 examples of conference-based approaches. These bold and innovative examples conferences could consider to ensure that appropriate amounts of distributed revenues are spent on the core educational purpose of college sports, rather than investing disproportionate amounts on seeking competitive advantages. Conferences could use one or more of these examples or design their own. Our first example requires that a school spend an amount equal to at least 50% of its shared athletics revenue distributions on athlete education, medical expenses, or other health, safety, well-being purposes, or send the money to the university for use in university academics, similar to what President Barron outlined the Big Ten presidents did many years ago with their conference revenues. The commission modeled how the 229 Division I public institutions would perform against this criteria, and that detailed information is found on our website. While a summary result is while all non-Power 5 programs at public schools would meet this criteria, only 9 Power 5 programs met the criteria. Again, the calculation considers only shared revenues received from the NCAA or conferences in the calculation. Implementation of just the Transformation Committee's proposals may not put some Power 5 programs over this threshold, given the growth they will experience in their overall shared revenues. In our second example, conferences can create limits, spending targets, and/or penalties on regulated operating expenses. For example, there could be a targeted threshold on regulated expenses that could include coaches' salaries in the aggregate. In example 3, conferences could address excessive coaching salaries or buyouts within the conference through a luxury tax system. To create accountability, conferences could assess financial penalties for total coaching salaries that exceed a certain limit. To be clear, these care model examples we just shared can be implemented at the conference level today, again, without intervention or help from Congress and without any change in the current Division I governance. Conferences imposing financial penalties on their member schools is already done in a number of areas. For example, this slide highlights an existing conference financial penalty to ensure compliance with the conference policy on access to competition area, or more commonly known as a policy against storming the field or storming the court. This policy imposes up to a $250,000 penalty for noncompliance. This same penalty concept that already exists could be used at the conference level to hold member schools accountable to the principle of financial responsibility. So to conclude, a couple of slides on the key takeaways of our presentation today. First, it is not speculation. It has already been defined for us. The CFP is expanding and will likely generate $1 billion more in shared revenues for FBS schools, with a large majority of that money benefiting the Power 5 schools. New revenues are also coming to schools in the Big Ten and SEC as a result of new conference media deals. Without changes to the spending patterns or new policies, spending projections on coaching compensation and coaching buyouts will continue to be indefensible. There are solutions that leaders can implement without an act of Congress to address governance, finances, and equity. We believe there must be financial changes to create accountability and alignment before the coming financial explosion. First, align CFP revenues with the national cost for FBS football. 2, acknowledge CFP revenues are the distribution system for the sport of FBS football, and thus take the sport of FBS football out of the NCAA distribution system. Again, it technically doesn't meet the criteria to qualify to be counted as it currently is, since the NCAA does not operate its championship. 3, implement the Knight Commission's care model to address financial responsibility with a conference-based approach, as well as adopting the equity recommendations related to distributions. All of these solutions can be implemented now and will better ensure that shared revenues are directed toward athletes' education, health, safety, and success. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sandy to facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you, Amy. And if you are participating virtually, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. And here in the room, please use the microphones. As you put your thoughts together, I want to introduce a few of our panelists, and then we have a couple of questions teed up, and we'll open it up to the audience. Joining us in person is Knight Commission legal consultant Gabe Feldman. Gabe is a professor of law at Tulane University, where he serves as the director of their sports law program and as the university's associate provost for NCAA compliance. Joining us virtually are two financial experts who can answer questions about the financial slides. Upton, project manager for the Knight Newhouse College Athletics data and explanatory journalism at Syracuse University. Also joining us is Matthew Borchard, principal of data analytics at CLA. We'll start with a question to Gabe. The NCAA reps have said that without federal legislation to provide antitrust and other legal projections, it will be difficult to govern nationally and continue to provide opportunities for all college athletes. How does the CARE model address that concern?
Sure, thank you, and good to see everybody. There's a lot of different ways to answer this question, but I want to be as brief as possible so we can cover other areas as well. The Transformation Committee and now the new Subcommittee on Congressional Engagement have made it clear that a priority of the NCAA is to get Congress to intervene, to provide antitrust protection, to provide preemption of state law, and to make it clear that college athletes should not be classified as employees. And part of the argument is that the NCAA cannot agree or cannot come up with a plan to restrict spending, to restrict compensation, unless it has that action from Congress. And what Congress has shown, as many have shown, is a desire to try to help college sports, to try to help maintain what is special and unique about college sports, to maintain that primacy of education. So the question is, how do we get Congress to act? And I think this is where the Knight Commission has a slightly different perspective than the Transformation Committee. And from what I've heard so far on the Subcommittee on Congressional Engagement, the Commission believes that Congress is unlikely to act unless they are presented with a specific plan that will reemphasize the primacy of education, that will show how the dollars will be redistributed so that they all won't be spent the way they've been spent the last 50 years. And that's in part what the CARE model does. And whether you agree with all or some or none of the CARE model, it is at least a specific plan or part of a specific plan that can be presented to Congress so that Congress can look at it and say, we want you to be able to accomplish this. And in order to do that, we need to give you some protection under the law. But it seems to us that you need the plan first and then say, that's why we need your help, Congress, rather than say, help us, Congress, and then we'll come up with the plan. So I think the CARE model or other plans like it are a key step to getting Congress to act. And that's not just our opinion. That's from talking to staffers, to talking to people on the Hill, that they want to see something specific. They're not just going to give a get out of antitrust jail free card.
So Gabe, go drill down just a little more specifically, and how does the CARE model help the NCAA address antitrust and the legal risks that they face?
Yeah, so I'd say there's two aspects to it. One is, Amy mentioned, a lot of it can be done at the conference level. And there is at this point almost zero risk of agreements that are made at the conference level. No matter how restrictive they may be of athlete rights, athlete compensation. The Supreme Court has made clear that conference level agreements would be okay. The plaintiffs themselves in the antitrust cases have said that conference level agreements would be permissible, as conferences are currently constituted. But even if we assume it's a national agreement, because many believe that individual conference agreements are unsustainable because of the natural competitive forces of those conferences. But even if there is a national agreement, one thing that the CARE model does, again, is tries to reemphasize the primacy of education. Now, why is that important? Because that's what the antitrust cases are about. That's what the labor cases are about. The courts have given special treatment to college sports because they saw college sports as special, as different. And they're special and different, particularly from pro sports, because they're about education first. The more that we move away from that, the less likely it is that courts are going to defer to what the NCAA does. So we need to double down on the educational mission, restrict the spending, ensure that the spending goes towards athletes, goes towards the educational mission. At least at that point, you can go into court and say, we are trying to maintain what's unique about college sports. And if you lose that lawsuit, you lose that lawsuit, then you can go to Congress again and say, look, we tried and we need your help. But right now, what's happening in this deregulatory environment where there are payments being made that I think many believe are pay for an athlete to attend a particular school, and decisions that are being made day after day that de-emphasize education. The message that's being sent to the courts and to Congress is that college sports is not as special as it used to be. And if it's not as special, why should it get special treatment? So I think we have to get back to doing the things like the CARE model does that makes it clear that college sports are different than pro and therefore need to be treated differently under the law.
Thank you, Gabe. Amy, share with us how specifically the Knight Commission solutions align or do not align with the Transformation Committee's recommendations.
Thank you. So as we've said, there are very good recommendations in the Transformation Committee report, and clearly the outcomes will be excellent for Division I athletes. But again, the recommendations do not go far enough. Here's where we're different in our thinking. We've called for, again, a more urgent and comprehensive solution for revenue distribution of the college football playoff revenues and the NCAA revenue distribution. So again, going back to our recommendation for the CFP, for a national championship that will generate between $1.5 billion to $2 billion annually, those revenues at a minimum should cover the national costs for operating the sport of FBS football. And clearly, our CARE model, as Gabe said, goes much further in addressing not only the distribution incentives, but the use of the shared revenues that, for all of Division I is more than $3 billion annually, and will approach actually $5 billion annually, given the expanded playoffs and also the new conference media contracts. So again, if help from Congress is desired, there must be a more comprehensive plan than what the Transformation Committee has provided that addresses the influx of CFP revenues.
So please, if you have questions,
athletic conference. And thanks for all this great work as a mid-major without football. Clearly, we experience a lot of what you're describing. I would be curious, though, there was no mention of sort of the hidden cost of bearing risk, which to me is probably the largest cost right now we hold as an NCAA, and the fact that, we provide a legal shield for the football schools. And so I'd just be curious why there was no mention of that in the recommendations.
Yeah, great question. I will say, in terms of the NCAA does serve as the legal shield for FBS football. So again, that's one of the key points as well in terms of covering the national costs, that the CFP revenues should go toward, number one, the annual legal cost, but also the cost of the settlements and those bigger costs as it relates to FBS football. as it relates to, we've tried to stay focused on the financial impact. We have another report and recommendation we put out in 2020 that actually called for would be its own organization, and the NCAA then as an organization would be freed of any FBS related litigation. We didn't bring that up because we don't want to confuse the issue, which maybe I just now have, but I wanted to point out that was another solution, but we understand there's not a lot of interest by FBS schools to do that. And so our point now is, regardless of whether FBS football operates inside the NCAA or outside the NCAA, the CFP revenues have to be addressed. And again, now is the perfect time because there's new money coming in through the CFP. So now is the time to correct the misalignment of the past.
I'm going to insert a quick virtual question, which is a perfect follow-up, and we'll come back here. This is from Michael Bazemore. Is there a reason you are not recommending the NCAA conduct the FBS championship as it does for all other sports?
I'll jump in on this, and Eric, if you want to jump in as well. We try to stay with recommendations that we think are realistic, frankly. And there's been a lot of interesting terms used in terms of, will the NCAA ever take over the FBS football championship? And we don't think that's going to happen. It's kind of interesting. I think this is historically correct. The postseason football and conferences running the bowl games and all of that, existed even before any NCAA championship. And so there's a long history there of the current operation outside the NCAA system. And the NCAA looked at conducting, its own playoff back in the early 90s or before the 90s, and that didn't go over well. So again, we've tried to stay on what is common sense, what can be done and what should be done. President Barron, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I think that was a good answer. And it does go to the fact that it is hard to all of a sudden make changes with what you have. I think it's why it's so important to think of this as new revenue is an opportunity, but to completely change the board would be difficult. And I think there's, at least it seemed to me as part of the management committee, a sense that the playoff is run very well. And so why change something that's working well? So it becomes more, how do you use new dollars to make important strategic decisions?
Thank you. We'd like to go to the room now.
Sure. Dennis Scanlon, Penn State University. So as a faculty athletics rep, I can easily stand behind the primacy of education, which several of you have mentioned is the point here. But a couple of questions. I'm wondering if you've linked in your thinking the dollars and everything that you discussed to the transfer environment. It may not be a direct causal link, but there are monetized costs to institutions and to individuals of what we're experiencing in individual student athletes in terms of what we're experiencing in the transfer environment in the sport of football, but other sports as well. So what am I talking about? Academic progress being delayed, lower graduation rates potentially. There's been a number of statistics. I'm not sure that I've seen anything comprehensive, or sort of completely as well done as perhaps we need. But those would be the cost of, again, if you could link causally, and the question is how much of this is due to the money. I think many people think that it's in part due to the money. This movement around the country, delaying academic progress, delaying degrees, delaying graduation rates, all these things have costs that can be monetized and certainly don't support the primacy of a college education. Institutions increase compliance costs. For example, everybody in an institution in D1 right now is seeing the impact of a very short window when the transfer portal opens in the sport of football, and the beginning of our academic semester that starts, sometime in January, and all the work and all the cost and all the movement in trying to kind of fit that all together. Obviously, there are legal issues and regulatory issues that have led to the transfer environment as well. But I guess I'd encourage the trying to connect that, because I think there are real monetary costs. The other one, of course, would be what some have described as FCS schools, serving as kind of the sort of the minor leagues for transfers to the FBS. And it seems like there's something philosophically or fundamentally wrong with an institution making a commitment to someone in the form of athletic aid, having them stay a year and then move. As an individual, I don't fault any student athlete for sort of wanting to move, but the question is, what about the monetary cost of that school or that institution that made an investment in that individual and now basically gets no return on that investment? So curious as to whether those are issues that you've thought about.
I'll start the response, and Gabe, I don't know if you want to add anything, but clearly the transfer environment and the chaos of the portal has been impacted as well due to the fact that NIL has not been regulated. So I think that's an obvious concern, and one that hopefully can be addressed moving forward with a better plan for applying actually the principles and the rules as it relates to NIL. And I would say that, very, very great points. I'm glad you brought up the impact on the FCS, because again, we're seeing FCS conference moving into the FBS. There's the financial incentives to remain in the FCS are not real strong right now. And so again, what's happening in FBS, expanded playoffs, is having an impact on the FCS, the health of the FCS, and we believe our solutions would help make that healthier, but certainly that impact needs to be considered as well.
The only other thing I'd add quickly is I think there are sort of two approaches to modernizing the NCAA rules and rule books, and the approach that's been adopted, and I understand why in the wake of the Alston case, but the approach has been to try to eliminate or minimize any rules that might create additional antitrust liability. And that has its benefits because it does potentially minimize additional liability, but it has its problems because as you deregulate, again, you look less like the college sports that we know it, where athletes are getting paid in name for NIL, but it certainly seems like in many cases they're getting paid to play at that school, and they are quickly transferring from one school to another if they can to get that money. So it looks a lot more like unregulated pro sports than it does like college sports. And you say, well, we'd like to restrict the transfer portal, but we're afraid of getting sued. And they say, well, why don't you restrict what coaches do if you're going to try to restrict what athletes do? And they say, well, we tried to restrict coaches and coaches' salaries and we got sued and we lost. And that's true, but that was one case in the 10th Circuit over about 30 years ago. And I don't think that decision should be driving how the NCAA moves forward. I think what the NCAA should be doing moving forward is say, let's look at the big picture. What would we want to do to make it so that education is the primary driver of college sports? And that may include greater restrictions on coaches, on money spent on athletics. The problem is when it's just restrictions on college athletes. That's where the litigation comes. And so that's where it comes back to having the broader plan, something like the CARE model that says, here's how we're going to rein in spending across the board, not just on athletes. Here's how we're going to try to restrict free agency, not just on athletes, to try to make it so whether it's the coach or the athlete, it's about the primacy of education. And then you can go to Congress and say, here's what we want to do. We don't think we can do it without getting sued. Now come in and give us your help. I think that's what's the missing piece here, is just sort of piecemeal trying to address transfer portal, trying to address NIL without addressing the overall landscape and how to make overall changes to make college sports unique again.
Thank you. We do have one media question virtually, and then we'll conclude with your question. Thank you. From Liz Clark at the Washington Post, what do you see as the most powerful, realistic lever to force the change in spending priorities the Knight Commission proposes in advance of the influx of the over $1 billion in new revenue? Is it the new NCAA president? Is it threat of congressional intervention or actual intervention? The courts? Is it mobilizing action by college athletes? Is it university presidents and CEOs? Is it public shaming? It's a whole lot there.
Yeah, I'll give one aspect of the answer. I don't know if it's the most powerful, but I think it's pretty clear if we stay on this current course, where the courts are watching to see how college sports defines itself. And is college sports different than pro sports? And the answer has always been it's different because the focus is on education and the athletes aren't paid. And if we then get an influx of $1 billion+ and that many judges in this country are going to give any deference to college sports. And they're going to say, you want special treatment, but you're not special. You just took $2 billion and spent it on facilities and coaches. And you continue to have revenue drive the decisions you make about your athletes. And this would be just yet another decision that's made that is not about the primacy of education. So I think from my perspective, we have to wait for the crisis moment. The crisis is here. People have heard me say we are the dog having the cup of coffee in the fire saying this is fine. It's not. If we don't act now, then the change is going to be forced on us, whether it is by the federal courts in the antitrust litigation that is already pending, whether it's by the National Labor Relations Board, whether it's by the Third Circuit that's about next week to hear a case about whether college athletes are employees under FLSA, whether it's state legislators. Someone's going to see, well, if Congress the NCAA isn't really serious about protecting what's unique about college sports, why should we do it as the courts? So to me, that would be the greatest lever is if you don't change, it's going to be forced on you.
I think what's unique is we're at a point where crisis is meeting opportunity with these revenues. This wouldn't be possible, I think. It would be far too difficult to do it without those revenues. And my belief is, having been an ACC president and a Big Ten president, is the presidents want to have changes like this, but it has to be a collective. So I'm willing to bet that it's all of the above working together to take advantage of the opportunity, because we've been talking about the crisis for a long, long period of time, but we've never had a financial opportunity like we have today.
Thank you. And we'll conclude with our in-person question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Matt Brown. I'm the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter with D1 Ticker. I think to piggyback on these last few questions, I can certainly appreciate the Knight Commission laying out here a desire to mandate and to make sure that certain allocations of funds go to supporting college athletes. But to kind of piggyback off of what Gabe just mentioned here, there's certainly plenty of external forces, not to mention potential labor organizing, that are calling for direct financial compensation to athletes, not in the form of support, but in the form of cash. For payment for labor. I'm wondering here if anybody in this group sees a way where those two systems could coexist, or if Knight believes that funding should only be going towards supporting of athletes rather than any direct financial payments in the near future.
Thanks, Matt. So I think, what you've offered is another hybrid model, maybe for a certain segment of schools. And what we presented today is based on our current model. And the simple answer to your question is to explore what you're talking about in terms of let's look at other hybrid models that may need to evolve and develop, would be another 60 to 90-minute presentation, which we're at the end of our presentation. But I would just offer that we are at that moment where very different ideas need to be studied. And we've given a lot of thought. We have data. Obviously, this is one, a series of solutions that we think, should be on the table. Not to say that there needs to be discussion of other potential hybrid evolutions, but so that's where I'm going to end it with that. Anybody else want to? Okay.
For a final comment, I just want to say that, we're living in times with immense change with 2 and 1 of the transfer in the NIL. And, at some point, I know that, Gabe's talked about it and we've talked about it as a commission as well. You think, especially the NIL piece is going to level out, right? Like, will these funds sustainably be able to go forward at the amounts they're going to? So I think there's going to be, over the next 2 to 3 years, a lot to figure out in terms of what does that market look like from an up and down standpoint. But also, I think that as President Barron and Amy have mentioned, like the timing's now, because you do have so much change at once, almost, let's call it what it is, so much chaos. And within the chaos, there's a lot of opportunity. So, I think the Knight Commission is super excited about putting forth these opportunities, but, it's going to take an aligned leadership, as President Barron said, to really try to rein this in. So I'm really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Jacques. Perfect closing comment. It is a pivotal and historic time in college athletics. And on behalf of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, thank you for your engagement, your participation. Both the session and the materials will be available online should you desire to access them on our website. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.